Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. I am very happy to see you all here gathered for the lecture by Professor Hein de Haas on how migration really works. My name is Lenja Slierendrecht and I work as program maker for Studium Generale, and me and my colleagues organize lectures like today, but we organize all kinds of events such as open stage nights, a talk show, movie nights, as you could have seen on the slides behind me. You can subscribe for our newsletter and follow us on Instagram to stay up to date about our events. For years, the debate over migration has divided global politics, and now the divide seems even wider than ever. The media show almost weekly images of dangerous crossings on the Mediterranean, and politicians promise to curb the influx of migrants and asylum seekers. Others argue that, on the contrary, we desperately need immigrants to stimulate growth and innovation. But what are the facts behind the headlines, politicians' claims, and the decisions they make? Professor Dr. Hein de Haas will tackle several myths about migration with us today. Hein de Haas is Professor of Sociology at the University of Amsterdam, endowed Professor at Migration and Development at Maastricht University, and the Director and co-founder of the International Migration Institute at the University of Oxford. He is the author of the book Hoe migratie echt werkt, translated into How Migration Really Works, which is in both languages for sale here today at Boekhandel van Gennep. We are very happy to have him here today, so let's give him a warm hand of applause, Professor Hein de Haas. Thank you.
Oh. Yes. Thanks for the invitation. Really happy to be here. Yeah, migration is one of those hot topics, right? And you would think somehow it has been a hot topic. And for those who are a bit younger, this is not a new topic. I've been researching migration for the last 30 years. And as long as I've been researching the migration, but reading the literature, we could easily say over the last century, migration has been a hot topic. I mean, it comes in waves. There's times other things dominate the headlines, but migration is this recurring topic. Whether we look at Western Europe, whether we look at North America, but actually across much of the world. And you would think that a hot topic should be a lot of information about, right? The striking thing, and also the reason that I decided to write this book, How Migration Really Works, is that it struck me and it frustrated me over the years that although there is so much knowledge about migration, in my book I talk about a century of migration scholarship, that very little of that knowledge actually filters through to the public debate. And it seems a paradox. It is explicable though, because if a topic is highly polarized, what usually gets out of the window is the nuance. So the biggest problem, I say, is not a lack of knowledge. We have a science of migration out there, and I'm going to present some of the insights from that science of migration. The problem is the framing of the debate. And that's also something you can really see in the media, and it reflects many of my personal experiences when I try to participate in public debates, like appearing in debates on television or radio, or just in rooms across the country, whereas in Britain or in the Netherlands or in other countries, time and again, frustrating experience. And it came to me at some point, it was sort of a penny dropped during one debate about 10 years ago. This was during the influx of Syrians into Europe, that this journalist who was leading the debate asked me, who in the audience is with Professor de Haas in favor of migration and who is against migration? And this was this penny dropped. I think this is what is wrong, and this is why it always goes wrong. It is the framing of migration debates in polarized pro and anti terms. This is obviously a totally silly and childish way to discuss a serious issue like migration. Have you ever heard a journalist asking an economist, Mrs. or Mr. Economist, are you in favor or against the economy? I mean, to ask somebody whether she or he is against or in favor of migration is like to be asked a person whether in favor or against markets or agriculture or music or, let's say, the weather. You may like it or you may like it not, but of course we all know that migration is of all times. This is a huge cliche I almost hesitate to share with you, but it's a cliche that needs repeating. To think away migration, or to think we can just turn it off and on, it would be like to think away a fundamental part of who we are, who we've always been as human beings, who we are and who we will be. And what is happening in that polarized debate is sort of pro and anti-migration camps, of course, cherry-pick evidence. They use evidence, but in a very selective way. What goes out of the window is the nuance. And that polarized frame has been paralyzing migration debates for decades now, and is a major obstacle for gaining a better understanding of migration, because it leaves no room for nuance. And when I sometimes, in the past, talked to senior policymakers, they would sometimes tell me, I know you're right, but putting in practice what you're saying or sharing your insights with my constituencies would be political suicide. And that made me increasingly skeptical to this idea of intellectuals speaking truth to power, because power does what it does. It ignores the evidence that is not convenient, and that's why I decided to write this book. This is not an academic book. I really wrote it for the biggest possible audience. I think the public deserves to know what is really behind the headlines and behind the smokescreens. And I'm very happy that the book, which I wrote in English originally, has been translated into 7 languages, and 6 more languages will come out in the coming half a year. And of course I'm happy, because this is why I wrote the book, and I really want the insights in the book to reach the biggest possible audience. The central claim of my book, and also my story tonight, is that policies often fail. We know that migration policies often don't work. I mean, nobody likes migrants suffering at the border. Nobody likes asylum seeker centers that are overburdened, certainly not for people living there. Nobody likes if migrants get exploited, certainly if they have no papers. Nobody likes the fact if segregation happens, if isolation of migrant groups happens. Of course, nobody likes violence in the 2 extremes almost that we see as well. The question is, why have policies failed to solve those issues? European politicians have been promising for the last 35 years or 34 years, since 1991, to solve the border crisis in southern Europe, across the Mediterranean. We have to ask ourselves the question, well, this has apparently not worked. All the fences we've built and all the border patrols we have invested in, and you could say the same about the United States-Mexican border. So, because policies fail, migration policies, because they are not based on a real understanding of how migration really works, and that also motivated me to give the book this title. Now, what I try to do in the book is to break through this deadlock by equipping readers with insights on the dynamics, causes, impacts of migration based on scientific insights. But it's not just a series of myths I'm trying to tackle. What I'm trying to say is that we need an entirely new way of looking at migration. We need a new paradigm. We need a new vision. Not of migration as either a problem to be solved, or on the other side, a solution to problems, things of aging, for instance, or labor market problems. No, but as it is, as a fundamental part of who we are, and of migration as an intrinsic part of much bigger processes of global change, development, and economic transformation. In other words, we cannot think it away. We may like it, we may not like it, and that also explains why the extent to which policies can influence migration is by definition very limited. And if policies try to row against the tide, they almost invariably fail or actually have counterproductive effects. So what I'm trying to do is to present this new vision that is based on facts rather than fears, based on evidence rather than ideology. And I'm trying to do so by questioning 22 popular myths that are peddled by politicians not only on the right, but also on the left, media, and international organizations. Now, of course, I cannot tackle all of those myths tonight, but I will tackle 5 key myths that illustrate a number of very commonsensical, intuitive ideas many people have about migration, but that need to be questioned fundamentally once we look at the evidence. And the first one is this idea that we live in times of unprecedented mass migration. And this is actually the most widely shared idea about migration on both sides of the political spectrum. It is often linked to issues of poverty, inequality, conflict, climate change, but also think about infrastructure. We live in this connected world with means of communication, the internet, transport, it's so easy to travel. And the idea is that all these factors compounded have created this massive increase of migration pressures, growing numbers of people trying to pour across borders, and increasingly desperate attempts of rich states to sort of contain this flow. But it is often linked to this idea of the world is on fire, there are many problems, and then on the right and the left you might hear different solutions. Perhaps on the right we hear more often we need even more stringent immigration controls. On the left you may hear, well, we need to solve those problems like wars or poverty in poor countries. But the underlying assumption is actually similar. And this is one of the things I discovered when I was doing background research for my book, that some of those ideas are actually shared by both, let's say, both sides of this debate. So everything amalgamates into this notion of a migration or a refugee crisis. Well, and it is supported by images like this. This is during the Syrian refugee crisis, now about 9 years ago. Of course, the tabloid press in the UK, but everywhere else is, of course, playing a big role, mass media, in conveying this idea of this massive flood of migrants threatening to cross the border, invasion rhetorics. In the Netherlands, we hear tsunami, etc., etc. But also serious academics like Paul Collier, a world-famous development economist at the University of Oxford, has written this book, Exodus, How Migration is Changing the World. Well, the title Exodus clearly evokes a certain image. And also the photo on the cover shows this massive emptying of the global south, with the fish jumping over from the southern to the northern fishbowl. But also organizations like, in this case, the United Nations Environmental Programme published a map already back in 2005 that shows sort of environmental crisis zones, and the idea was this will create massive, massive environmental migration in the world. So we see that from different angles, this idea of this growing migration pressure, the floods to come, is actually shared. What can we say when we look at the evidence? At the least, we could say it's a slightly more complicated picture. This is the best data we have on migrants in the world. So migrant is defined as a person living in another country than their country of birth. And since 1960 to 2017, we see a steady increase in terms of numbers. And nowadays, we talk about somewhere around 270 million international migrants. Well, that sounds a lot. But to know whether all these forces of poverty, conflict, easier communication, travel, have really accelerated migration, we should not only look at absolute numbers, but also at relative numbers. And we know that over this period, the world population also increased. So the next question is, what percentage are migrants of the total world population over the same period? And we basically see a very stable pattern. Roughly 3% of the world population is a migrant, was a migrant. And migration historians argue that during the times of massive European migration to the Americas, roughly a century ago, this number was actually way higher. Now, I cannot speculate about the figures, but what is clear that in relative numbers we don't see a sort of increasing intensity of world migration. To express this number in yet another way, here the red parts of the bar are actually migrants in the world. Actually, the most striking fact is that the overwhelming majority of the world population does not leave their countries. I think that's something important to keep in mind. Despite, indeed, problems we have in the world, despite poverty, despite conflict, and so on and so forth, the vast majority of people prefers to stay at home and puts that in practice. So this, in a way, already challenges some of these ideas. Now, you may ask, what about refugees? Well, that's the next graph. This is a graph from my book that shows yearly border crossings by international refugees. And what you basically see, there is no trend. Back in the 70s, there was a peak around is there a pointer here? No. Anyway, you see it 1991, there is the Bosnia war, then we had the Syria war, and this Russian invasion of Ukraine. There is basically no pattern. I often compare it to a ping pong ball going up and down, and obviously the main cause is conflict. And we see also a very rapid decline of refugee migration once conflicts are over or become, let's say, more stable in a certain way. So in the longer term, there's no real increase. Actually, refugees are roughly 10% of the total migrant population in the world, which means that 0.3% of the world population is a refugee, and over the longer term, those numbers don't show an increase. What of course happens is once you have a peak, politicians start to panic and extrapolate it in the future, but in practice, actually, that doesn't happen. Another thing, and another idea, is that all refugees are on the way to Europe or North America. But again, the data challenges this. This shows where most refugees live in the world, and actually most refugees live in neighboring countries. That is a familiar pattern for migration more generally. Most people stay in their own countries. Once they leave their country, they go to the neighboring country. That also goes for refugees. 80 to 85% of refugees stays in the region of origin. And politicians talk a lot about regional solutions. In Dutch, we talk about, I forgot the term, anyway. What is it? Opvang in de regio. So that is already practice, in a way. And of course, but this idea of a growing percentage of refugees moving out of the region, the fact is that two major conflicts broke out, Syria and Ukraine, in relative geographical proximity of Europe, and that's the main reason why we've seen those recent refugee peaks in Europe. But let's not forget that the vast majority, Turkey is actually the biggest refugee hosting country in the world right now. And quite some African countries and also Latin American countries are quite dominant. So yes, there are refugee crises, but most refugee crises actually happen in regions of origin. What about these sea crossings, often called as irregular, illegal migration here across the Mediterranean? And again, these are some numbers. These are, of course, significant numbers. This is one big peak, and this was the Syria sort of movement of refugees from Turkey into Greece. But also their numbers are fluctuating. But if you compare that to total migration to the European Union, legal migration, we talk about roughly 50 to 100,000 people who get on those boats, rough estimates. This is around 2 to 5% of total yearly legal migration to the European Union, which is around 2 to 2.5 million, sometimes 3 million. This is not to diminish the problem of people dying at the border. The issue is to put it in perspective. And what it shows is the extent to which our ideas have been distorted by political narratives and media coverage, in which it almost seems that most migrants from outside Europe come with those boats. Just one statistic, I estimated that 9 out of 10 Africans moving to Europe does so legally with passports and visas in their hand. Again, this is not the image you would get if you listen to politicians or see too much media coverage of migration. So, this is to put the whole thing into perspective. Roughly 83% of the world population has never migrated. The biggest migration category are those moving within countries, 13% of the world population. And this is this idea of this big rural to urban migration. And this has happened in Europe in the recent past, this massive transfer of people from rural to urban areas linked to industrialization and this whole transfer. And some of these people will move abroad, but the larger majority of people stay within their countries. In China alone, there are more people moving within China, so more internal migrants, roughly 300 million, than international migrants in the world. So the real migration story of the last century is internal, so-called domestic, rural to urban migration. And compared to that, international migration is a relatively small share of total mobility, a relatively stable share of total mobility. And you see how small the refugee proportion is, 0.3% on average in the longer term of the world population. Well, this, of course, puts things quite in perspective. So terms like exodus or invasion are totally inappropriate to talk about the changing patterns of world migration. But does that mean nothing has changed? Yes, a lot has changed. And that explains, particularly from a European perspective, why things look totally different than they used to look like. Why? Because it was, of course, Europe that has been the ultimate emigration continent over the last 5 centuries. Ever since the so-called discovery of the Americas, Europeans were the colonists, soldiers, enslavers, missionaries, settlers, and ordinary migrants later on, who moved to the New World, the Americas, but also Australia, New Zealand, and later also to colonies in Asia and Africa. Did Europeans ask permission to do so? No. And if you define illegal migration as crossing a border and settling somewhere else without asking prior permission, I think you could easily argue that European colonialism was the biggest illegal migration in human history. And this was an invasion, because unlike migrants today, Europeans did come with weapons and gunboats. And this was a fundamental game changer, of course, for the colonized territories. It didn't affect Europe so much. There was a lot of migration going on, of Europeans moving out, but also Europeans, of course, enslaving Africans, also shipping indentured so-called coolie workers from Asia to their colonies. So Europeans were doing the big movements outside of Europe largely. Those processes have been fundamentally changed since the end of the Second World War, in a process which I would like to call the global migration reversal, in which Europe transformed from the main emigration continent to a very important destination for migrants. As Europe lost its colonies, but also Europe started to grow very fast, increasing labor shortages led to an increased effort to recruit workers for either former colonies or from the so-called guest worker countries in the Mediterranean, think of Turkey, Morocco, Italy, to work in the industries, mines, and other sectors in northwestern Europe. So it was the change from outbound to inbound migration. The drying up of Europe as a main source of migrants for the New World had also consequences for migration to the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and countries like South Africa. And this picture actually shows this. This is transcontinental migration, so migrants really going over long distances. And the highlighted area is numbers of Europeans that cross distance. As you see, a very rapid shrinking of Europeans actually moving over large distances. Europeans have stopped migrating, but increasingly Africans, Americans, but particularly Asians have joined the global migration stage. And Europe, this is the black line here, has become this immigration continent. I already talked about the 2 to 2.5 million, sometimes 3 million people who migrate from outside the European Union to the European Union. This is, again, predominantly about legal migration. So Europe has shifted, and of course it makes it totally understandable that from a European perspective, things are totally different. And Europe has known increasing immigration. Most European countries now, 10, 15, sometimes 20% of the population, sometimes even 30%, Switzerland, of the population are an immigrant. And many of these immigrants come from outside Europe. That is a game changer from a European perspective. But it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with global migration running out of hand. It has to do with the changing geographical position of Europe on the global migration map. And that, from a European perspective, a Eurocentric perspective, makes it very understandable. This seems a totally different story. And this is migration to the United States. Also here you see that the proportion of Europeans, the lowest area, has shrunk fast, and it's now Latin Americans and Asians that dominate immigration to the US. Of course, for the US, immigration is nothing new, it's in their DNA, but again, it's really about where migrants come from. This is a rough map of migration in the world over the last half a century. What it basically shows is, one, how complex migration is, and that most migration in the world has nothing to do with a massive movement from poor to rich countries. People actually tend to move between countries, between regions. It's a much more complex pattern than this idea of the global south emptying out on the global north. Actually, most people move within regions. Well, this is problematic. It doesn't mean migration cannot create problems on the local level. Of course it can. And particularly in neighborhoods where a lot of migrants concentrate, it can lead also to problems. Migration can be a good thing. It also has potential negative sides. But it has nothing to do with the massive invasion, this swelling flood of desperate people coming to Europe or to North America. In conclusion, there's no reason for panic. What about the second idea? I would say this is probably more popular on the right-wing side of the political spectrum. And it seems like a no-brainer, right? You make it more difficult to cross a border, then less people will come. Well, this is if you have very simplistic understanding of migration as a sort of one-off movement, a sort of cost-benefit analysis people make, and then they will decide to cross borders or not. But it's a very simplistic understanding of migration. If we really want to know how borders affect migration, we have to look at the entire process of migration, because migration is a continuous social process of people coming and of people going back. And that's the normal pattern. We call this circulation. So if you want to understand the effect of a border, you have to look at the entire process. And there, evidence shows that in many cases, immigration restrictions that ignore the real causes of migration have unintended effects that can either make the policy ineffective or totally counterproductive. So we have built those fences here at the Spanish exclave of Melilla on the northern Moroccan coast. We have militarized border controls, but what has happened to migration? We've built all these walls and fences since the fall of the Berlin Wall. How has it affected migration? So the real question is this circulation. Normal migration is a process of coming and going. This is what we see within the European Union. This is what we see within countries. What happens if you introduce a border? What happens to this entire process? And what we know from a lot of good quantitative research is that migration tends to interrupt this circulation. And one major study we carried out on migration to Europe, to North America over the last decades, try to measure, for instance, what is the introduction of a visa, what effect does it have on the entire process. So what we measured is, yes, if you introduce a visa, you make it more legally difficult to come, it reduces on the average in migration, so the number of people coming in, by 67%. Well, you think that's effective. Indeed, walls and restrictions help. But what did it do to return migration? Decreased it by 88%. You don't have to be a mathematician to understand that the result is you end up with more migrants. Because in a way you reduce inflows more than return flows. And politicians are always interested in net migration, how many people will stay. Well, if you reduce inflows if you reduce return even more than inflows, you end up with more people staying. And this is typically what happened in Europe with the guest workers. Once you made it more difficult, they decided to stay. The more difficult you try to come, the more migrants stay. What do migrants do once they decide to stay? They bring their family members over. I call this the migration multiplier. And this is why policies with European nations to basically send migrants back to the guest worker countries like Morocco, Turkey, actually ended up with an opposite result. And we still see that today. This is the Moroccan-Spanish border, again, at the border with Ceuta on northern Morocco. We often see that ill-conceived restrictions push temporary migrants in permanent settlement. Because the more difficult you make it, the more people invest in their visas, in their papers, or sometimes to pay a smuggler, the less you actually go back. And this is something policies often haven't foreseen. Look here, for instance, African migration to the old core nations of the European Union. Increased clearly over the years. This is, by the way, legal migration. But you see the red line? It's an increasing bifurcation. People no longer went back. More and more people stayed. So the policy actually resulted in the exact opposite of what it intended to do. Now, migration restrictions can have also other unintended effects on the timing and psychology of migration. I think the best case is Suriname. Suriname is a former Dutch colony, and Suriname was part of the Dutch Kingdom, and that meant that Surinamese, as Dutch passport holders, could move freely to the Netherlands. That created increasing policy concern in the 1960s, early 70s amongst Dutch policymakers who wanted to stop this free flow because it was increasing and they saw it as undesirable. But there was a problem. The Surinamese are Dutch citizens. What do? Well, the only way to stop it is to de-Dutchify the Surinamese. That actually created an almost reversal of normal dynamics where the colonized nation wants to accelerate independence. In this case, it was the Netherlands who wanted to accelerate independence to get rid, almost, of part of the kingdom so their inhabitants would no longer migrate freely to the Netherlands. What do you think many Surinamese thought when independence in 1975 was on the horizon? It is now or it is never. A huge migration peak to the Netherlands. And the Netherlands then thought we're going to introduce visas in 1980, and then we had a second wave. In a period of less than 10 years, 40% of the Surinamese population decided to migrate to the Netherlands. Of course, we also know once you make it more difficult to cross a border, you actually create a smuggling industry. So the idea that smugglers are the cause of illegal migration is causally wrong. Because smuggling, I'm not saying it's a good thing, but smuggling is a reaction on border controls. And if people still have good reasons to cross borders, either to flee conflict or to pick up a job, then people are willing to pay a smuggler, because a smuggler, in essence, is a service provider. So let's not blame the smugglers. In Dutch, we have this term, waterbed effect. Yeah, you know, hear these claims. The Tunisia deal was a success. That is what always happens. Of course, if you start to control at one point of the border, flows will decrease, but we also know that migrants and smugglers adapt their trajectories. For instance, migration now to the Canary Islands is going up. And we've seen this process over the last 30 to 35 years. We cannot control this entire border. We would need, in a way, to turn Europe in a sort of gigantic North Korea. It is not possible, and everybody knows that. Of course, it has sad consequences. The Mediterranean has become the most lethal border in the world. So this doesn't seem really to do the trick, right? So is then this idea of development in poor countries, that is a small solution. You often hear it political leaders say, we're going to put up a Marshall Plan for Africa. African leaders also buy into this narrative. You need to give more aid so our young people no longer have to come and make those dangerous journeys. The Biden government also started its root causes strategy to try to tackle the root causes of migration. And it seems really smart, right? It seems like this smart way of thinking about migration. It seems more humanitarian, but it's also rooted in some problematic assumptions on why people migrate and what are the actual root causes of migration. So helping staying of people at home is somehow based on this, I would say, stereotype of migration, particularly from poor countries, so-called South-North migration, as this desperate flight from misery. It is rooted in a one-sided victim thinking that represents migrants as economic refugees, fleeing oppression, poverty, violence, or as victims of smugglers and traffickers selling false images of El Dorado. And of course these things happen, but it is not representative. It is a one-sided perspective. In general, research shows that migration is an investment in a better future. Migration creates better opportunities, but migration is also expensive. Who of you is a migrant? Some hands. And who's an internal migrant within the Netherlands? Now, almost everybody is a migrant. Are you miserable? Actually, we know from research that migrants generally are a positive selection of their origin communities. Migrants are rarely amongst the poorest and most desperate members of their countries of origin. Why? Migration is expensive. It requires a lot of resources. Even if you're, let's say, an undocumented migrant on a boat, that is expensive. It may cost you thousands of euros to make that journey. That's a huge risk to take. But in general, as we know that most migration is legal, that requires often an education, knowledge, diplomas, qualifications, and that is why the highly educated, all you hear, migrate way more than the lowly educated, and that is generally a world pattern. What are the main emigration countries of the world? Mexico, Turkey, Morocco, the Philippines, India. Are these the poorest countries in the world? No. And that's not a coincidence. Migration in general is an investment in a better future. And in a way you could say, migration itself is the best form of development aid. Did you know that migrants on an annual basis send back $500 billion to their origin countries? That is 2.5 times more than official development aid. And of course that money flows straight from the migrant to the families back home. You could say it's a bit more efficient too. And that of course drives migrants to make that is often an investment of a family in a better future. Of course it doesn't always work out, but that is what drives people to take risks. That is what drives people to endure exploitation, because people have the longer image in mind. So migration is expensive, so we have to question this whole perspective. Perhaps you've heard about the push-pull framework that visualizes migration as this drive away from sources of misery. And that's why people migrate, but actually from the poorest countries in the world, much less people migrate than from the richest countries in the world. So this is the image of desperation. Again, media drive this. But when I was doing research in Morocco, where I've done 3 years of field work, you actually see that, look at GDP per capita in Morocco, it kept on going up, and also immigration kept on going up. And I think, how can I explain this? It doesn't seem to make sense. The country is much better off, but even more people cross the border. So I discovered also when I looked, for instance, African migration, it's not from the poorest countries in Africa that most migrants go, for instance, to Europe. And that's not a coincidence. There's a literature, there's a whole migration science that looks at how development actually drives migration and finds some surprising findings that question almost anything we think about South-North migration. Well, the first graph is a very intuitive one. What it shows, I ranged countries in the world in 5 so-called quintiles, ranging from very low levels of human development to very high levels of human development. And the first graph shows a very intuitive pattern. The better off a country is, the more migrants live in those countries. So the Netherlands is clearly in a very high level, and on average those countries have 15% of the population is foreign-born. That is exactly the Dutch immigration rate. What it actually shows, you cannot be an open and thriving and successful economy and at the same time not wanting migrants. In a way, having high immigration is the almost inevitable consequence of being a successful economy. This is going back to this idea of looking at migration as part of much bigger forces of change. But the surprise is in the second one. What percentage of populations lives abroad? And here we see what social scientists call a non-linear pattern. Migration goes up. If countries become richer, poor countries become richer, better educated, get better infrastructure, more people start to move. And these are indeed the Mexicos and the Turkeys of the world. Of course, if countries really become richer, then they become immigration countries. And that is exactly what's happening indeed to Mexico and Turkey. But any form of development based on this theory and the empirical evidence in the poorest countries of the world, for instance in sub-Saharan Africa, will lead to more migration. Because it increases people's capabilities, resources, but also the aspirations. Think about the effect of schooling, access to information. Not as a result so much of poverty, but paradoxically of development. So Africa is bound to become the next big emigrator in the world. Asia already moved through that stage, but it has nothing to do so much with absolute forms of misery, actually with development. So it's a very, very different picture. So let's not make illusions. And I try to explain this also by coming up with some new sort of theory to think, how is this possible? I think, well, development increases at the same time people's resources they need to migrate. This is what I call capabilities to migrate. But also the effect of going to school, having access to information, typically leads to a change in people's. And this goes beyond money. This is about the way you want to live, the kind of lifestyle you want, away from traditional agrarian lifestyles to a much more modern, often urban lifestyle, generally imagined in cities, but sometimes also abroad. So this is what I just told you. So if you visualize countries in the world, you could expect, for instance, from big countries in for instance, sub-Saharan Africa, you could expect more migration from those countries. I want to say, though, we also know that most migrants are likely to move within regions. It is not like that everybody then goes to Europe. That's another fallacy in commonsensical thinking about migration. It's a bit more complicated. Well, what about this one? Migrants steal jobs, drive down wages. You could add on to this and other things in the Netherlands and some other countries. The idea that migrants also undermine welfare is also very popular. They take away benefits, they take away jobs, they bring crime, etc., etc. There's no evidence to sustain this claim. And in effect, we have to turn around the whole main causality of the argument. Many studies based on the best data have shown that labor demand and recruitment are the main drivers of migration. In other words, immigrants come to fill vacancies, not to take jobs. It should therefore not be a surprise that there is a very high correlation between business cycles and levels of immigration. With more migrants coming, more labor is scarce, and many returning when the economy is doing bad and unemployment is rising. Makes a lot of sense, right? Let's look at some graphs. This is The blue line this is for Germany, economic growth since 1972. It shows the business cycle. And the red line is net migration. Now, of course, sometimes there are peaks that have nothing to do with the economy, like the 2016 peak. But in the longer term, trends of immigration tend to follow economic trends. Another graph of the Netherlands showing something similar, right? The growth of the GDP, the yellowish line, and the blue line is levels of immigration. This is the reverse image. It is unemployment in the Netherlands and net migration. They're almost perfectly mirroring each other, and it makes a lot of sense. If there's no job, lots of people are unemployed, why would you invest in that migration? Why would you, if you're a labor migrant, why would you make all these efforts and pay so much money if there's no jobs? You probably wouldn't even get a job, which would get you a labor permit or a visa to migrate. But let's say you want to migrate illegally, then also that's an investment. When the Spanish economy tanked about 10 years ago, no Moroccan was thinking about going to Spain because they all knew there were no jobs. In other words, migrants are not stupid. Another graph, I think even more telling, is open vacancies in the Netherlands and net migration. Wow. You see this? Indeed, politicians have said we have too many immigrants. Netherlands immigration reached record high levels, many Western countries. That was part of the so-called post-COVID labor crunch. After COVID, many native workers that did all sorts of jobs didn't return to those jobs, and it meant that job vacancies with economic recovery were going through the roof. What about this one? As part of a Wall Street Journal op-ed that I wrote about apprehensions at the southern US borders and see the correlation with non-farm job openings. And if you would talk to people across the border, they all knew there were jobs on the other side of the border, and it certainly was part of their motivation to cross borders. And this, before I go to the elephant, and we'll head towards the end, what it shows is that if you really want to bring down migration, the recipe is really simple. You just have to wreck your economy. But that is, of course, what politicians don't want. And it is a central conundrum in which Western European, but also North American politicians have been with migration over the last 4 decades. On the one hand, the tough talk on immigration, and on the other hand, quite an understanding of the economic need for immigration. And it also means what's basically happening that behind the smokescreen of the tough talk, in reality not much happens. In practice, we all know that migrants do useful jobs, including irregular migrants. Think about people taking care of the elderly, of children, working in restaurant kitchens, picking strawberries, tomatoes. All these kind of jobs are done by migrants, often migrants without papers as well. And we know this is happening. And this is not just a story, it is real, and we have so-called smoking gun evidence that governments are not willing to do anything about this. That actually is quite convenient, the way we exploit migrants. Not only big corporations, but also families having a nanny without papers is a form of exploitation. Cleaning your house, etc., it's all around us. That's why we're able to eat out cheap, because often migrants work in those restaurant kitchens. It's not only a matter of big corporations, it is totally part of our lifestyle these days, certainly for the higher middle classes. And there is a wide-scale toleration of this illegal labor, but also non-illegal migrant labor that is often framed as fortune seekers, gelukzoekers in the Netherlands, but actually do all sorts of work that's quite essential, which came clear during the COVID crisis. And politicians are willing to massively turn a blind eye to this form of exploitation and the employment of undocumented migrants, despite all the talk about cracking down on illegal migration, smashing the gangs, whatever. Just one statistic. The number of employers in the United States, and the United States has roughly 11 million employers, that gets prosecuted legally for employing undocumented migrants is somewhere between 15 and 20. I'm talking about absolute numbers here. So that shows you something, and it also shows the elephant in the room of the whole migration debate. I don't have much time tonight, but roughly speaking, you could say on the right, migration is portrayed as this big threat that we need to stop with even more border controls. On the left, it's linked to we have to stop misery in the world and wars, and then it will all stop. But the real thing that isn't being said is actually this labor dimension. that migrants do all sorts of jobs, and as long as we tolerate this labor and we need that labor, they will keep on coming. So that 15 to 20 employers is roughly the chance to be struck by lightning in the US. It's basically a joke. Labor inspection in the Netherlands is complaining for years that they don't have the tools to actually control whether people are being exploited, and employers exploit labor of migrants with or without papers. And in a way, that to me shows the hypocrisy of political narratives about immigration that doesn't want to address the real issue. And that brings me to the Brexit conundrum, because you may think, Suriname, that's a long time ago. Well, Brexit, you see the same photo, right, that I showed earlier, actually was portrayed as this one way of getting rid of free migration, finally control the border effectively. And it seemed to make a lot of sense. In a reverse case of the Surinamese case, Britain thought, we need to get out of this European Union because it is the only way we can stop free migration from Eastern Europe into Britain, because that was the big issue at the time in the UK. Immigrants were being accused for taking away jobs, benefits, housing, clogging up the whole National Health Service. And the idea was, once we stop this free migration, those problems will be solved. Of course, as we know, those problems were not solved by Brexit, but that's not the issue tonight. What happened to migration? Because you would think, again, you get out of this thing, you stop these free inflows from the European Union, you would at least have seen migration declining to some level, right? Well, this is development of net migration to the United Kingdom, and clearly in the post-war periods, particularly since 1990s, you see that Britain has become this destination country. The ultimate colonizer of the world, of course, became an immigration country. That, of course, led to political crisis. And David Cameron's, oh my goodness, I give it away. David Cameron, you didn't see this, eh? David Cameron promising to keep net migration, we heard similar promises in the Netherlands, to keep net migration under the 100,000 benchmark, but he failed. This is when I lived in the United Kingdom. And then Brexit was promised. Brexit would finally do the job. Net migration was roughly 200,000 before Brexit, and it almost quadrupled after Brexit. Still not convinced that border restrictions don't always work and can actually have unintended effect. Many reasons why this happened. One was that many Eastern Europeans decided no longer to go back, but apply for permanent residence, you see, interrupting circulation, and you stay put and bring your family over. And another major reason was that labor shortages were higher than ever in Britain, also after COVID, and they still needed to get not only the low-skilled workers, but also the nurses and the doctors and the engineers, and they were just brought in from other countries, still partly from Europe, but increasingly from, let's say, India and Nigeria. And as the UK higher education system almost went broke, they needed more rich fee-paying students, again from countries like India, but also Nigeria, because Nigeria has also a rising middle class. So we have to rethink our way we think about migration anyway, but Brexit didn't do the job because, again, it didn't look at the real cause of increasing migration to the United Kingdom, and that was labor shortages. It gets a bit annoying, but I think you get the point. So what else does leave us? Migrants don't steal jobs and drive down wages. Migrants rather fill vacancies, and if there's no vacancies, not as many migrants will come. But that leads me to the last myth. And I think that is an important reminder, that migration is not only a good news story, because you know the pro-migration camp arguments are about, we need migrants to fill up vacancies, we need migrants to combat aging, we need to rejuvenate our population, migration is good for cultural diversity, everybody is happy. It's a bit interesting coalition between, by the way, left-wing open border persons and right-wing corporate powers that both want free migration. They're kind of strange bedfellows, and something doesn't work there. Because the evidence also busts the pro-immigration myth that immigration lifts all boats, that it's a blessing for all members of society and it just drives innovation and growth. No, migration is also not a solution. It is not a problem to be fixed. It's part of development. Migration is development in many ways, as we've seen. But it's also not a solution to problems. We know from very good research from already 25 years ago, conducted by the United Nations, that to really combat aging, you would need levels of migration that are roughly 5 to 10 times higher than they are right now. That's both impractical and politically never acceptable. Because aging, migrants also age, and aging is becoming a global phenomenon. Birth rates are going down everywhere in the world, and we know from research migration can't fix these issues. And although migration is not a major cause of unemployment or wage stagnation, the evidence also very clearly shows, and this is really important, that the most economic benefits of immigration go to the already wealthier members of society. These are the ones who either own the companies that can make higher profits by employing migrants, but also benefit, think about the middle class, from the service and labor provided by immigrants. And if you look at the lowest income earners, let's say the bottom 10 to 20% of income earners, see hardly any economic benefits from immigration. So it's not true that migration drives down their wages or that immigration is the cause of growing inequality. That has very different causes due to a change in economic policies and taxation policies and things like that. So immigration hasn't caused that. Lowest skilled native workers hardly see any economic benefits of migration, and they're the same who will often live in those neighborhoods and work in those places where they are most directly confronted with the real social and cultural change that immigration can also bring to the workplaces and neighborhoods, and which are not always necessarily positive. And this is some pictures of French banlieues, basically have become often social dumping places, where the native working class no longer wanted to live, besides the lowest income earners, and became big concentration of immigrants. And of course, governments looked the other way for many years towards those so-called guest workers, and that led to segregation and a real accumulation of problems. Now, it's not that migrants have caused those problems, it is rather the failure of governments to do something about the exclusion of immigrant populations that certainly in the second generation often became unemployed. But of course, from the perspective of native workers that are also living there, they may ask, what's in it for us? And it is particularly true for ex-migrants. Ex-migrants have the biggest reason to be worried about more immigration because they do often do similar jobs as migrants. So if there's one group who can see their labor market competition increasing by new immigration, it is actually ex-migrants. It's a very interesting sociological phenomenon that ex-migrants often turn anti-immigration. I call this the drawbridge phenomenon, a very nice Dutch metaphor. And in a way, you could say it's a sign of integration. You adopt the receiving country perspective, and you see the new migrants as, oh, they are the immigrants, we are no longer immigrants, we have settled. So, what do we do? What do we do? I hope that these examples have convinced you that we need to fundamentally rethink our understanding of migration. We need a new paradigm. It's a more holistic paradigm that sees migration as intrinsic and therefore largely inevitable part of broader change, economic transformations, globalization, and it also shows that a good policy takes that into account. And a policy that just looks away and treats migration like this tap you open or close, you've seen at least 3 or 4 examples, tends either not to work or completely backfire. I always say particularly people who want less immigration should be interested in this science and not ignore it. And I think what the evidence most convincingly shows that we cannot divorce debates about immigration from much broader debates about economic and social policies. As long as governments see maximizing economic growth and liberalizing labor markets as a top priority of public policy and keep on deregulating those labor markets, this will further increase labor shortages and it will create a lot of unattractive jobs that only migrants want to do and therefore will lead to immigration. You cannot have this open market economy in which we try to maximize growth and bring down immigration. It is simply not possible. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. And that is the elephant in the room, of course, that politicians don't really want to address. And this is the split in which politicians are. And that may explain some of the tough rhetorics on smugglers, on asylum seekers, but at the same time, this large-scale toleration of legal and illegal labor migration, in which, in fact, borders have rather opened than closed. If politicians are serious, really serious about decreasing a seemingly unsustainable dependence on migrant workers, this would require fundamental changes in economic and labor market policies. Basically, you have to re-regulate the labor market. One of the reasons Japan has structurally lower immigration levels is that Japan has much more government interference in the labor market. We have all these recruitment offices, right? They recruit migrants in a country like the Netherlands and all across Europe. Government would have to regulate that. I'm not saying that should happen, but that's my response to politicians who want to bring down immigration. And now you understand that a lot of parties in power don't want to reverse deregulation. So that's where you see the big split between what politicians say and do. Another example of how you need to think about migration more holistically. If France is going on strike against raising pension age, the French implicitly go on strike for more immigration, because who's going to fill in those labor shortages? That's another example. But I think more generally, if governments are really serious about taking back control, they should re-regularize labor markets and rein in the gig economy. Whether they will really want to do so, that's another issue. But I think more importantly, we cannot talk about immigration without talking about labor. We cannot address the exploitation of migrant workers if we don't also ensure that all lower and mid-skilled workers can earn a decent wage. And more generally, I think, restore the dignity of manual labor, particularly in the care sector and other services and industries that cannot be automated or outsourced, and that we are likely to need more than ever in an aging future. We should not be under any illusion that this will totally eliminate the demand for migrant workers, but restoring the dignity of work will help to motivate some members of the native-born workforce to do such jobs. And it will better protect native and migrant workers alike. And such policies would also spread the benefits of migration more equally to all members of society, instead of primarily to the already affluent, as is now the case. To me, all of this emphasizes again that we cannot decouple immigration debates from debates about economic policies, social policies, inequality, welfare, education, and how we treat the sick and elderly, and particularly treat migrants like people. I think the best summary of the so-called guest worker, migrant worker conundrum was by the Swiss writer Max Frisch back in the 1960s, talking about Italian labor migrants into Switzerland. And there was a whole debate in Switzerland about the Überfremdung, that Switzerland will be overwhelmed by all these Italian workers, because at that time Italians were seen as this foreign threat. But he summarized the whole conundrum with the following sentence. Wir riefen Arbeitskräfte und es kamen Menschen. We wanted workers, we got people instead. And I think that's the error we make time and again, and we're doing that right now with people working in Europe, in North America, doing all these essential jobs, but actually we don't really think about how will they become part of society. We basically treat them like commodities, and I think that's the problem. And more generally, I think it shows that any serious debate on migration will therefore inevitably be a debate on the type of society we want to live in. Thank you very much.
I saw many more hands, and I'm sorry that we don't have the time to answer all of these questions, but I'm sure Hein de Haas is willing to answer them here in the front. I hope.
It's still working. I've been lecturing 4 hours this afternoon, and now another 2 hours. Well, I'll try my best. Yeah.
I want to thank you all for being here, and I wanted to say again that just outside this room there is a bookstore, Boekhandel van Gennep, where you can buy both the English and the Dutch book if you are interested in the other 17 myths. I want to thank Professor Hein de Haas for his amazing story here today. So give him one more hand of applause. Thank you.